Very warm welcome to the audience to today's expert panel on aligning biomass production with human rights due diligence and food security practical approaches. My name is Lisa Marie Pücker. I'm a project manager for human rights at Carbon Solutions, and I will be today's moderator. Please note that we will today collect all your questions through Slido. You can either scan the QR code or go to slido.com and enter the code there. We will later on have a slot where you can ask the questions. Yeah, we can look forward today to a very rich debate on practical approaches on human rights, due diligence, and food security. And this will be reflected from different angles from our speakers today. Let's have a quick look at our agenda. After some opening remarks today, we will get a keynote speech from Theresa Hering from Welthungerhilfe. We will then get some insights on the core topics of our panelists, and after their presentations, we will then discuss their topics a little bit deeper in the panel discussion. And after the panel discussion, we will have closing remarks by Swantje Nielsen from BMEL. Okay, I would now like to welcome on stage Dr. Jan Henke from Carbon Solutions, Director of Carbon Solutions, and Dr. Raphael Schneider, Deputy Head of External Relations and Policy, Welthungerhilfe. Yeah, both organizations jointly manage the food security standard, which is a practical tool to implement human rights due diligence at production level. Dr. Schneider, from your perspective, you have a broad experience in the policy sector and policy interventions. Why is Welthungerhilfe as an NGO operating in the field of sustainability certification and private sector collaboration?
Good morning to everybody. Thanks for this question, Lisa. Welthungerhilfe is a civil society organization, and that we work mainly also with in the political dialogue to promote the human right to food. But it is completely clear that not only development assistance and the political dialogue will drive to sustainability and food security, but we need sustainable investments of the private sector. This will do long-lasting effects, and that's why we work with certification, because that are long-time established procedures to drive sustainability and to promote also social sustainability.
Thank you so much. Dr. Henke, based on your extensive experience in sustainability and carbon certification, where do you see the biggest benefits of the food security standard to strengthen the human right to food in biomass production?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. With MEO, we are indeed working on these topics of renewable resources, sustainability, climate change, and in particular certification for almost 20 years now. And to be honest, I do see a lot of potential still with certification schemes who can still better and more holistically implement the right to food. And here they can make use of the food security standard, which has been developed by Welthungerhilfe, us and other organizations, and which we now together put into practice. Companies can use the standard to show that they are in compliance with human rights due diligence legislation. Companies can use the standard also for voluntary markets to show to their customers, to their stakeholders, that they are actually implementing the right to food. And that's very important that the private sector is contributing here. And for us, it's very motivating and rewarding to work on this in the setup and with the entire team and to contribute actually and to create an impact on the ground. And it's a great opportunity to present this here today and also to have the support here from the German Ministry for Food and Agriculture and from the FNR here in Germany. And I think our panel today with the participants you have just shown also shows that there's still a lot of potential to further implement this really in practice and to bring forward the right to food in these value chains.
Thank you so much. Great. Very much looking forward to our today's discussion. I would now like to welcome on stage our first keynote speaker. Thank you so much. Theresa Hering from Welthungerhilfe. She's the project lead of the food security standard for Welthungerhilfe, and she will give us some insights now on how to put human rights due diligence and food security into practice. Thank you so much, Theresa.
Thank you. Does the microphone work? No. Is it now working? No. Test, 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 test. Hello? Now it's working, I guess. Yeah, also a warm welcome from my side. I am representing the food security standard today and want to give you a little bit of an insight what it means in practice, but also why food security is that important to realize in global value chains. So, bioeconomy relies on agricultural production for diverse use, such as food, fuel, feed, whatever you can imagine, and not only be the use sustainable, but also the production. This is really the matter of the food security standard, that the production is socially sustainable. But there's an overlap, as you see here on the map, between producing countries of agricultural commodities and those countries that are affected by moderate to alarming food insecurity according to the Global Hunger Index 2024. And as you see here, most of the hungry people work in agricultural production and produce goods for the global markets and also for global value chains. So, especially in the first steps of global value chains, food security and human rights risk are especially vulnerable. And as food security is a cross-cutting issue, which I would like to really stress here, without its realization, most of the other human rights can't be fulfilled long-term. And to tackle social issues like food security, but also other human rights, political frameworks are needed to create a level playing field, also for the private sector. And there have been political commitments also from the last GFFA. I put some quotes here on the slide to show you that the commitments are real and that we need to put them into practice. But also new due diligence regulation like LKSG, CSDDD, EUDR, they all demand corporate accountability and safeguarding human rights, also human rights like the right to food, which is sometimes forgotten because it's just mentioned in the annex. Solutions, which I would like to mention here, should be practical and also with low bureaucracy for the private sector. And frameworks like certification offer practical solutions to address social sustainability. So the food security standard is one of those instruments which we would like to present. It enables the monitoring of compliance with the right to food in agricultural production. It translates very practical the UN guidelines for the right to food into practice to really check them on site and on the ground. It is suitable for every type of agricultural product and also for all production sites and globally for every nation. It is a practical and proven approach to implement socially sustainable management systems on farm level, which is really important here. So it is a growing initiative for HRDD, for human rights due diligence, and how to put it into practice. So bioeconomy and food systems, so both of the frameworks, are basically two sides of the same coin. And the private sector plays a major role in realizing the fulfillment of the right to food. As I said, practical tools exist. Frameworks like the food security standard show, and I put here the map, So you can see what is done in practice that show that it works. But we need a broader application, and this is key. So systems like the food security standard need to be put into practice on a global level as a broader approach. And only when agricultural commodities are considered and human rights, so all agricultural commodities are considered and human rights are respected, bioeconomy can be sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we will now start with our insights into the core topics of our panelists today. And we will begin with an introduction to global governance approaches like sustainability certification and legal regulations. Please welcome on stage Professor Dr. Lena Partsch from Freie Universität Berlin.
Thank you. Quickly need to find out how to okay. Yeah, so the backdrop of our panel discussion today is globalization. And globalization means a challenge for social and environmental regulation. We have integrated national markets, but unfortunately this happened very often without or with little social and environmental considerations. To the contrary, very often social and environmental considerations, or you mentioned the human right to food, such regulations are seen as a negative trade barrier. Yeah? And today we will focus on coffee. Coffee is an example of a cash crop. The International Coffee Agreement collapsed in the late 1980s, and this meant that world food prices fell below production costs. And of course then it was a problem, especially in the global south. Yeah? Many farmers suddenly faced problems of food insecurity. And globalization also means that state governments lose political authority. There's little capacity to regulate global supply chain issues such as the global supply chains of coffee. The good news is there's growing awareness. Yeah, for instance, that the EU is responsible for 44% of coffee-related deforestation. And this is the fact, although, of course, as we all know, for climatic reasons, it's not possible to grow coffee in Europe. Yeah? But as you can see, the countries with the highest coffee consumption per capita are all in Europe. So Germany ranks 10th. And the 9 countries ahead of us are also in Europe. Yeah? So actually we need multilateral agreements between exporting countries and importing countries to regulate such issues like food security, food insecurity, and also environmental issues. Unfortunately, we don't have such multilateral agreements. The International Coffee Agreement, as I said, collapsed. So we need to look at alternatives, yeah? So let's look at alternatives. We will do so today in the panel. Alternative number 1 is certification. Certification is proof of standards in production and trade. And it means that consumers, and many do, are voluntarily willing to pay a higher price for essentially the same product. Yeah? The only difference is the label, but the final coffee is the same. And in the coffee sector is the sector with the highest compliance rate. At least, I mean, 27% of global production are certified, so about a quarter of the consumers is voluntarily willing to pay more. Yeah? But we also need to see that coffee certification private initiatives already started with fair trade coffee back in the 1970s, so half a century ago. And if you are aware of this, then it's actually 1/4 certified, but 3/4 are not. Yeah? So it's an alternative, but it doesn't help to really change the overall coffee sector. So let's look at alternative 2, the more recent alternative, that's public supply chain laws. Public supply chain laws are now used by consumer countries, entire countries, to also use their purchasing power, but the collective purchasing power to enforce rules on all importers and their suppliers. Yeah, so it's not voluntary anymore. It's not the individual choice of consumers, but it's the importing countries using their collective purchasing power. What remains the same with this alternative is that companies are still the ones who are supposed to enforce the legislation then in the exporting country. And the link is basically reporting. The reporting serves as a basis then for legal action in the importing country, in the regulating country. So this brings me to my last slide. I was told to be very brief, and I'm also keen on the other presentations. Challenges to discuss today. Reporting, yeah, there's a lot of discussion here also in Germany in the public media about reporting. Of course, first of all, reporting means a burden for all companies, yeah? Even companies already complying with your standard, for instance, they have to do the reporting now in addition for the public supply chain laws. And the problem right now is that many reports have a very poor quality, so they do not really serve for legal action. Yeah? So this is something we can discuss, and Lisa asked me to make the link here to certification. We can see that sectors where we have a high compliance with private certification, they also perform better now with reporting for public supply chain laws. Yeah? So the coffee sector is very likely to also perform better with regard to public supply chain laws. This is the first point. Second point I would like to discuss, and I think this is a very crucial point, is control and monitoring. Control and monitoring is so far very much left to NGOs, and NGOs are very much overburdened and underfunded. Yeah? So we also need to discuss how we can get funding for monitoring and control in the exporting countries, and we just discussed before this session. We also need to look at the people cooperating in the exporting countries and how we can provide security to them if they cooperate, for instance, with German NGOs against large corporations. Then this is the second point, Lisa's already looking. Then the third point is also about enforcement. Right now we have the German supply chain law, which is enforced already. The BAFA is responsible as a supervisory authority. We don't have legal liability yet, but it comes not for the German supply chain law, but it comes with the EU CSDD. About BAFA, we don't really know what BAFA actually does with the reports. On the website, they currently say they're not reviewing the reports. Some NGOs handed in complaints to BAFA, but we don't know what actually happened to the complaints. So there's not much transparency, yeah, so obviously there's some hesitation right now on the side of the importing countries. And then also if we look at the exporting countries, there's both cooperation and conflict, but also I think mainly there's hesitation. Some of the, in the case of the EU deforestation regulation, the major exporting countries actually handed in a complaint to the European Commission and the European Parliament that the EU deforestation regulation is not compliant with WTO rules. So this brings me back to the beginning of my presentation. Yeah, I think it's a question of priority between world trade and environment and social regulation. Lisa's already standing here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you for those insights. We will further have more time in the panel to dive into the details and discuss that further. We will now continue with a legal perspective on certification, on food security in human rights regulations. So please welcome with me on stage Max Jürgens, lawyer for trade compliance at Kettwig.
Thank you, Lisa. Just a brief introduction. Lawyer at Kettwig. You might not have heard Kettwig before because we were founded 17 days ago. We are very new. Prior to that, we were a big team of 15 lawyers at a different law firm, have been dealing with trade compliance and sustainability issues for many years now, and working together with Welthungerhilfe and FSS during that time as well. Having said that, I will dive into sort of a bit into the legal background of some of the issues discussed today, and start with where does the right to food actually sort of come from in the context of all these new EU due diligence requirements and German due diligence requirements. Now, the right to food under international law is enshrined in the International Covenant on Economically and Social and Cultural Rights, and is usually regarded as part of the right to life under the International Covenant for civil and political rights. Now, it's not explicitly mentioned in any of the acts like EUDR, CSDDD, or even the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Under the CSDDD, we have it, though, under the right to life, which is explicitly mentioned. So one can say that the right to life, as something that companies need to look at in their supply chain, is part of at least the CSDDD, but as we can see, it's also part of all the other legal acts. Under the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, LKSG, it must be reviewed in particular serious offenses. Under the EUDR, it becomes relevant if there is a link to deforestation or the protection of biodiversity, which in most cases it is. Plus, and this is probably the most important point, it's a cross-sectional right or cross-cutting right, I think is what Teresa mentioned earlier. We can't guarantee the right to food if certain other human rights are not protected at the same time. And if you look at certification that, like the FSS, which views the right to food, they are also reviewing all these other rights because it's part of the right to food. And in terms of the legislation that we're looking at, we therefore don't look at sort of particular, if we do sort of a mapping of, what due diligence obligations can I fulfill with certification, we look at the concrete content of the certification. What are the criteria that they are looking at in all of these audits? At least for the FSS, we can say it's quite a broad coverage of all these protected rights. I'd like to sort of continue almost the presentation from Professor Patsch because I'd like to give some insights into how the German regulator looks at the implementation of human rights due diligence within companies. And I think it's an outlook on how the other EU authorities are going to look at this topic once the CSDDD, which still has to be put into a national law, becomes effective in all EU member states. And it's also an outlook on how probably the regulator will view EUDR. Now, we currently have different kinds of investigations by BAFA, occasion-related investigations and ad hoc investigations. By about late last year, the statistic was that BAFA initiated 52 administrative offense proceedings because companies did not actually implement the CSDDD. Sometimes it was smaller things like they didn't name a human rights officer in time. Sometimes it was bigger issues. But that goes to show that the German regulator is taking this topic serious, and they're not afraid to start these investigations, to start implementing fines, etc. So it's really a wake-up call for a lot of companies in Germany to get ready and to implement the supply chain due diligence obligations. The ad hoc investigations mainly pertain to responsibilities in organizations. Later last year, we saw sort of ad hoc investigations where the BAFA asked, okay, how do you do the risk analysis? How do you organize your risk management? Interesting is, or very of more importance, I would say, are the occasion-related investigations on the basis of media reports, something BAFA read in an article, and the most sort of, I think, for companies most difficult to tackle are the complaints by affected persons brought forward by NGOs. And we currently represent several clients in these investigations, and there are some key takeaways that we have. First of all, by late last year, the German regulator said the NGOs will now be involved in the actual administrative proceedings, which means they can receive access to files, which is a huge issue because every information that companies provide in these investigations may now go to NGOs and may then end up in sort of the public arena. We also saw in one case, which we successfully sort of were able to close, that on-site audits are an extremely important way of dismissing or even confirming allegations or complaints. And the BAFA asks especially large companies to carry out these on-site audits because they say, listen, you large companies, you have the resources to do it. Hire someone, go there yourself, but look at the situation in the affected countries. And then the principle of shared responsibility is a huge issue for BAFA. They're saying passing along these supply chain due diligence obligations is not something that is appropriate under the law. You need to think about cost sharing, cover costs at the supplier level for many of these issues. But BAFA is also saying, listen, the professional insights by certification bodies, by local auditors are very important for ensuring this compliance. And to just tackle one issue Professor Patsch said, I think in terms of certification, we're kind of seeing that these public laws, German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which are obligations, and then these voluntary certifications, they're kind of melting together because a lot of companies want to fulfill their due diligence requirements in that way. And I think that is it. Lisa is next to me, so thank you very much. I'll be happy to discuss these issues later today.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, we will now continue with a perspective from a standard owner on how a certification scheme can support with due diligence obligations. Please welcome on stage Pia Lorenz, Senior Sustainability Manager at 4C Services.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Well, hello and welcome from my side. So I will be representing 4C and the standard owner perspective today. 4C is an independent, stakeholder-driven, and internationally recognized certification standard for coffee and cocoa. And the 4C system was developed through a multi-stakeholder process, and it ensures its compliance with of the certificate holders with the criteria, what we call our code of conduct, via independent third-party audits on site. And as you can see on the graph here on the right, about 1/5 of global coffee production is 4C certified, which amounts to 1.8 million metric tons of green coffee produced annually. And among this production, the vast majority of producers and farmers are smallholders, which in 4C terms means that they grow coffee on an area that's smaller than 5 hectares. So how is human rights due diligence integrated into the 4C requirements? Human rights due diligence is deeply embedded in the 4C Code of Conduct, which forms the backbone of this certification. And along the 3 dimensions of sustainability, which you probably all know, our Code of Conduct is divided into the economic pillar, the social pillar, and the environmental pillar. And within every dimension, we have different principles and criteria that split up the certification requirements. Within the economic dimension, long-term productivity is ensured of the farm operations, but this also includes the IMS, the internal management system, as we call it, and this includes risk and needs assessment of the group of farmers, but also in terms of human rights. This entails the identification and prevention of human rights violations, and to develop respective improvement plans and trainings to work on those. The more evident link might be within the social dimension. Here, this covers two principles, which are human and labor rights and working conditions. And this also includes aspects like grievance mechanisms, for example. In addition to the existing social criteria within the 4C standard, 4C has developed two so-called add-on certifications. Add-on means that they're applied on top of the core standard. And here we have the Advancing Equity, Empowering Women add-on, which focuses on gender equality and children's rights. And we have the Food Security add-on in cooperation with the FSS standard that covers not only the human right to food, but also, as mentioned already before, other cross-cutting human rights. And here, grievance mechanisms are put into an extra focus. And lastly, on the very right, you see the environmental dimension. This covers all environmental sustainability criteria of agricultural production. And here we also have an add-on certification, which is the carbon footprint add-on, covering the calculation and reduction of GHG emissions. So how can 4C serve as a tool to strengthen human rights due diligence obligations? Here you can see the core obligations, and as already explained by the previous speakers, certification can cover the risk analysis, assessment, mitigation, prevention, and monitoring. And the most obvious link might maybe be in reporting, as audit reports are being produced after audits. They're being provided to us, reviewed, and 4C certificates are publicly available on our website, as well as the logo can be used on and off pack to report on successful certification and compliance with the 4C standard. In terms of preventative measures, 4C offers supply chain mapping to its system users, as well as regular trainings and projects on the ground. And within the certification, we also follow the principle of continuous improvement, which means that over the course of the certification cycle, improvement plans are followed with respective improvement measures and a monitoring system to ensure the continuous advancement on those areas of improvement. We also have frequent risk assessments. For example, remote sensing tools are a mandatory part of the 4C certification. We also produce heat maps for our system users, and our integrity program aims to ensure the compliance of the certificate holders with the 4C system via integrity audits and assessments. And the aspect of monitoring is mirrored in our commercial reporting system, where mandatory reporting of 4C sales and purchases is performed via our traceability platform. And respective improvement measures, as I said, are regularly monitored in annual updates and surveillance audits. And lastly, as mentioned already, grievance mechanisms are a vital part of the 4C system, and they are a part of the core certification already, but are particularly stressed in the Food Security and Advancing Equity and Empowering Women add-on. So, in a nutshell, I would like to stress that, as it has already been mentioned, certification is a proven and efficient tool to control sustainability risks in especially highly complex supply chains. And therefore, it is also recognized as such a tool in the respective regulations. Certification systems, and especially 4C, continuously improve their standards to stay ahead with emerging due diligence regulations. And they also cover areas that are not covered by laws and will continue to do so. And when it comes to certification, I would like to stress particularly that those benefits mentioned can only be guaranteed by third-party certification systems. So this is a fundamental part. But certification systems always need to build on a thorough existing due diligence system of the respective companies, so it can only be a complementary tool. It's not a free ticket or white card with which companies can buy their way out or be freed from obligations, but it is a tool and a toolbox for them. So this brings me to the end. In case you're interested, feel free to reach out to us, and looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pia. Quick reminder for the audience, we have the QR codes here for the Q&A session later on, so feel free to add your questions there. Yeah, we will now continue with some practical insights from a company perspective. I am very much looking forward now to get to know more from... Yeah, welcome on stage, Benedetta Camilli. You're Head of Agri-Feedstock Initiatives and Programs from ENI. Very much looking forward to your insights now.
Can you hear me? No. All right. Hi. Well, I would like to start this conversation today to talk about just transition, you know, a just energy transition, which for ENI, we are an integrated energy company. It's not just about innovation. It's a commitment to transform the way that we have to produce energy, but also to consume energy by ensuring that no one is left behind. So now agri-feedstock initiatives really aim to develop a sustainable supply of raw material, so what we call agri-feedstock, for the production of biofuel. How? Creating a model that can integrate agriculture with the need of energy sector. So nowadays, these two sectors, not that I have a huge conversation among them, to be honest. Why? Because we must contribute to decarbonization of those sectors that are hard to abate. And we must think about aviation, we must think about maritime transport, we must think about heavy transport. So in accordance with this, ENI developed a distinguished model, I would say distinctive model, and I'm really confident that this is a unique example worldwide about that, of vertical integration for the production of biofuel, focusing on vegetable oil from severely degraded land and intermediate crops. Now, if you know these two categories, severely degraded lands and intermediate crops, have been recently added by the European Union as eligible for the production of agri-feedstock, so raw material, for biofuel production. And also we capitalize on the valorization of agri-industrial residues. So keep in mind these two categories. I will give you now a practical example, but try to follow me on this journey. So why we vertically integrate? Basically because we need to secure our supply of feedstock. We have company need to fulfill, and the market of biofuel is extremely fluctuating, and the availability of raw material over the next year, I'm talking about sustainable raw material, is gonna be pretty challenged. So that's why we vertically integrate to secure the supply. Here are the numbers, I'm not gonna through that. Trying to have a competitive cost compared to the market, because the market is going to be challenging and fun over the next years. We are able, by controlling the entire value chain, to select feedstock and to produce them in a way to allow low emission. We are targeting carbon neutrality. I personally dream about carbon negativity on the final biofuel we're going to put on the market, eligible for SAF. So we are looking at the aviation sector as one of hard-to-abate sector. So now, as I say, we welcome the recent evolution of the EU directive. Our value chain are certified according to ISCC, I'm very happy that over the last year, we managed to establish a great collaboration with MEO for FSS. We actually received our first certificate on FOSSEM in Kenya. We are really working hard to introduce the low ILOC certification worldwide. And this initiative actually have important partnership worldwide, because we do believe in existing proven external tools, yes, 3, to implement our initiative. Certification, but also international cooperation with the World Bank and with the ILO, which are inside our value chain to ensure sustainability of our process. Now, I talk too much about this, but just to point attention, here we're talking about industrial initiative. Pia mentioned 1.8 million of coffee. Well, here we are talking about more than 700,000 farmers involved, mostly in Africa, in this initiative, with 1 million hectares affected and regenerated by this kind of initiative, and the production over 1 million of tons of animal feed and fertilizer deriving from our value chain. Talk too much about theory, let's see how it works. First of all, because I'm really foreseeing a question about this, we do not own land. We work with farmers on their own land, with cooperatives. We have contract agreement with aggregator, large, small, whatever. They supply the product. Land is not our. Land must be of the farmers. We are not farmers, we are an energy company, and we have no intention whatsoever to enter the agricultural sector ourselves. We invest in oil extraction facilities. The product is delivered to us. We process the seeds, we process agro-industrial residues, we produce vegetable oil, then is exported to our biorefineries for biofuel. Byproducts of this process are transformed in animal feed and fertilizer that are commercialized on the local market. All these value chain are accompanied by strong presence on the territory through capacity building initiative, sustainable farming practices. We provide an access to market. Usually this type of contract works on long term. So we provide long-term access to market to farmers, and we give them back support for the value chain. This is my last slide. It's just to give you the scale of this initiative. We have a worldwide footprint. We feel home in Africa. ENI was, if not the first one, I think the first in many of the countries in Africa to establish first our presence, and is where they call us actually an African company in this sense. We have our long-standing relationship. Which kind of crop you are looking at? We are looking at non-food crops on severely degraded land, on castor. ENI was absolutely the first mover, and we're moving as also as follower on cover crop and valorization of agro-industrial residues. Looking forward to the discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We will now have our last speaker, and then we will continue with the panel discussion to dive a bit more into detail. Please welcome with me on stage Michael Kitetu. He will give an insight on social audits. He is an expert for voluntary sustainability standards and a lead auditor. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Just quick. Yeah, thank you so much once again. First things first, my slides may not be the best in terms of reading or taking photos, simply because I'm getting you a practical approach. We have had the previous speakers talking about the need for certification and also a strong statement about on-site audits. I needed to give you a practical experience of what happens during an on-site audit, because I think it's very important for you to get that in addition to the theoretical knowledge about the need for the laws that have to be applied on the ground. So typically and quickly, an audit only forms as a start process of developing or rather evaluating existing documents. That's usually the first step. And then the second step takes the form of taking the relevant management representatives and members of a particular organization through a one-on-one engagement. That's an interview process. And then the third and the last important part of an audit process, it's about field inspection and facility inspection. So once you gather information, details from these three key areas, then as an auditor, you triangulate that information to help you make a judgment. At the end of it all, you prepare a summary report that we call a non-conformity, or in a moderate, fair way, we call it a continuous improvement plan. That is what is used by the particular organization to correct the gaps that are existing and then comply with that particular certification. Now, having said that, it's critically important when we talk of human rights due diligence in agricultural producers. Question one that we need to ask ourselves is, who is this being applied to? What is the potential? What is the ability and capability of these people to put this into practice? Because these laws will apply to the persons doing the production as a requirement. Otherwise, they will not be in a position to access a certain market because of the supply chain laws. So first and important is the living conditions of those workers, farmers, and members. Secondly, is the applicable legal requirements that applies to them. Are they able to meet the existing national regulations first before we had extra regulations? And then the third important part is the food security status. It's quite unfair to produce, export, and that you're left when you're suffering. So that now answers the question, or brings into context where the need to support implementation of these supply chain rules, and very particular about human rights due diligence. This is a shared responsibility. If we leave these to the producers themselves, we are setting ourselves for failure. They are not alone able to meet the requirements of these laws. It's critically important to initiate measures as companies and organizations that want to source from organizations that are committed to human rights, support and guide producer organizations. Secondly, and important also, it's important to establish dialogue and collaboration with them. This will help in future in creating long-term business relationships, just like it has been mentioned here, that E&I provides long-term contracts to the members they work with. And then third, complexity of supply chains. This is also very important. Some supply chains like coffee and cocoa, they're very complex. And also they're dictated largely by a lot of interest in the producing countries. there are a lot of bottlenecks that exist, and therefore it's equally important to have that in mind. Then the last point, the second last point actually, the cost of compliance. These new regulations are bringing in an aspect of compliance. The cost of implementing the practices that are proposed, which adds a burden to the producing organization. And therefore, it's very important to have that in mind. When we are thinking about these new good laws, how are we supporting the farmers, the producing organizations, to meet the cost of compliance? And a practical way of helping producers to meet this that I've seen working with 4C and food security standard is where a combined audit process helps them to reduce the amount of investments that goes into that effort. So last but not the least, I stress the fact that for a fruitful and effective implementation of supply chain laws, there is every need to establish collaboration within the value chain. And we have in mind, compliance is not a one-man show, but a shared responsibility. Thank you so much. I will be very happy to receive questions. I know a lot goes into that, but I would love to answer specific questions from your end. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, we will now start with our panel discussion, and we got some very short insights now from all our speakers for now. We have so many different perspectives, which I really appreciated here. We got to know more about global governance approaches like regulations and certification. We heard a legal perspective here. We got to know more from how a company puts it into practice, and we also heard about how it's impacted on the local level. We will now dive a little bit deeper into these topics, and I would now like to welcome our speakers again on stage for the panel discussion. Okay, I would like to start with the topic of shared responsibility. That was a word that was highlighted several times today. And Max, I would like to start with you. We talked about this concept, and it's about sharing the responsibility within the supply chain. Why do you think is that important, and how can it also be assessed from authorities?
First of all, it's important, and this is a very legal answer because the regulator says it's important, so we have to follow it. No, but I think for a long time, companies in Germany were kind of, very skeptical of all these laws that are coming, and suppliers were very skeptical as well because obviously there's new compliance requirements coming up, etc. And the way I think we need to view the concept of shared responsibility is, especially from a supplier perspective, as a chance of improving one's own compliance, while at the same time, telling a company in EU, a customer in the EU, listen, I have these costs of compliance because you are obligated under your laws to make sure that I'm compliant. So you should also be responsible in terms of cost sharing, in terms of providing resources, etc. So I think instead of saying, we're going to look at other markets or anything, the concept of shared responsibility from a supplier's perspective could be almost a benefit for suppliers if they look at it that way as an advantage. That's at least, I think, the hope that the regulator and the German government had when implementing or passing all these laws. Obviously, from a company perspective in Germany or in the EU, it's different because it means the cost of compliance go up, right? But at the same time, we have a lot of compliance costs, sanctions list screening, anti-corruption laws that need to be followed. You need to provide resources there as well. Now you have another topic. It's a reality. It is a reality, and the law is what it is, and it's going to be an EU-wide law with CSDDD. So that's the way it's probably going to go in the future.
Thank you so much. Michael, maybe you would like to complement here. Where do you see the role in the concept of the shared responsibility? Where do you see the role of producer organizations, and how can they benefit from this approach?
Thank you, and that's a very good question, actually, to link up with what has been said. Number one, the role of a producer is to commit. They need to commit to do due diligence within the organization. I think it goes beyond what is being proposed by the laws, but for them to be able to actually access the markets that are being protected by the laws, then they have to commit. They have a responsibility to commit. The number two role I can say is that they also have a role to ensure their members are fully trained and understand the laws. They need to do capacity building to their members so that their members understand what is required and they actually put that into practice. The number three that I can say also is they need to be very cognizant of protecting the environment as well as respecting social related matters to their workers. It's their duty, it's their responsibility as certificate holders. Yeah, and a key benefit that might result us from this is that the business partners they are working with will be so much interested to continue their trading relationship, and these provide a market access for them. These also provide an opportunity for them to safeguard the rights of their workers. They are working with them by conducting due diligence activities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry. Benedetta, from a company's perspective, maybe you could share some insight. How is E&I putting this concept of shared responsibility into practice?
Yeah, I mentioned some of this, but I think this is really for E&I, and I'm not talking just about the agri-feedstock, but the entire company. The sense of shared responsibility is really embedded in the strategy of the company, also for the traditional oil and gas sector. So the last bullet point of Pia, which I really actually really like in our presentation, was that these systems must be embedded in internal policies of the companies, otherwise they're not effective. And this is really our example here. This kind of shared responsibility must lie in internal policies of the companies, which is really inherent in E&I strategic position, cross-cutting in any kind of business we implement, and then it has to be transferred on each single type of business that we implement. The agri-feedstock initiative really have a strong impact on communities, and that's why we generate long-term values by collaborating with stakeholders, government, communities, research center on the territories, in order to be leaders in the transformation and with local communities facilitating the access to market, introducing a good agricultural practice, and at the end of the day allowing the social economic development of the territories where we work. Otherwise we fail. This is what I think.
Nice, thank you so much. Pia, from a standard owner's perspective, where do you see the role of shared responsibility, and how can a certification scheme maybe also support here?
Thank you, Lisa. Well, actually, as already mentioned, we consider ourselves as kind of a tool or a toolbox to bridge the gap between the producers on one end of the supply chain and then the companies on the other hand of maybe highly complex supply chains. So we are the toolbox to use, but yeah, as already stressed, we work within an embedded due diligence system, or this is kind of the fundamental stepstone to put certification on top. And we as 4C also put the producers, as I said, the vast majority of 4C certified producers are smallholders, so we always try to put this perspective into the continuous development of our standard, so to not implement criteria just for the sake of making a standard more complicated, but really to keep in mind the effectiveness of the standard and the impact at the end of the day of certification for the producer.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. When we talk about the idea of shared responsibility, we now talked about it within the supply chain. But we also talked about the EU regulations and that they are coming from the EU. So Lena, where do you see the role of the EU to support other supply chain actors?
Yeah, so during our discussion, I just thought trust is good, control is better. And I think the role of governments or the European Commission is to provide control, because let's assume, yeah, most companies, and I'm sure most comply with human rights commitments, but some don't, yeah. And then we need enforcement, we need legal action against these companies, because in the current situation, I mean, in a common market, those companies benefit that actually do not comply with the legislations, yeah. And I see what Maike said, that it's a problem if it's passed on to the suppliers and really to the lowest level. But some of the requirements are also about basic human rights, yeah? So it's about clean water for the workers on the plantations, yeah? So we should not only talk about the costs that are handed down or upwards the supply chain, but also about rights, yeah? So that, and it's about human rights in the case of the EU supply chain. So it's really providing human rights to all people. And yeah, and I think that's the EU and the regulator as such, governments, the German government, that's their first responsibility towards companies.
Maybe just briefly sort of jump on that. I think in Germany we had the problem for a long time that we had the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which was only relevant for German companies. And if in a different EU country, you could still, you know, without any supply chain due diligence, import your goods and source them from different countries. And with the CSDDD, we now have a harmonization within the EU. But looking at it globally, we definitely see that the market requirements are different, and that human rights due diligence is seen differently by different markets. And I think, you know, once CSDDD is being implemented by the member states, we'll see how human rights due diligence actually changes the market, or if it doesn't. You know, the hope would be that it doesn't, that actually, you know, other big markets also implement due diligence requirements, like the USA, who already have certain due diligence laws. But yeah, I think,
we see that in the timber sector, that there is really a diffusion, and also that Western companies are not against it. Yeah, the EU timber regulation, EUTR, will be replaced now by the EUDR, the EU deforestation regulation. But we can see that US and EU timber industry are actually in favor, because they want to get rid of competitors that do not comply with the legislation. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Just want to provide a rejoinder. From a practical point of experience is that producers are already implementing due diligence within their organizations as a default. We have a lot of things that are being done as we're speaking now, but they've not been actually incorporated within the structure or the framework of the HRDD that is coming. So let it not be assumed that this is a new thing that is being introduced to producers, but already some actions is happening. But one of the challenges that we've experienced on the ground is that there's no proper way to communicate these actions that are being implemented. And that's where I'm saying support is needed so that some of these things can clearly be communicated to the outside world that indeed these things are happening. What is not happening is what we need to initiate proper mechanisms of sharing the responsibility. Thank you.
Yeah.
One last point, because I think this is such an important point that you mentioned, and from our experience also with discussions with BAFA, it's always the sentence is always, you know, don't change things that are existing. Adapt them if necessary to the changing requirements. But if there are good, you know, if there's good due diligence systems that are not sort of the perfect version under German supply chain due diligence, like, don't change it if it works, you know. And so it's really making maybe small changes here and there, but not sort of changing an entire process simply because there's new regulation that you need to keep. Thank you, Michael, for that point.
You want to add on that, Michael? Or okay, great. So we now talked about the certification and about due diligence regulations. In your opinion, Lena, how far can and should they be aligned?
Yeah, I mean, also for timber was the first sector where we had supply chain legislation, and it was also one of the first sectors where we had sustainability certification, like with the Forest Stewardship Council already invented in 1993 as one of the first global certificates. And then the discussion was whether because the public supply chain laws were only about legality and not about sustainability, whether now we don't see sustainability certification anymore, although sustainability is actually more ambitious than legality. And what we can see is that there is an increase in both, I mean, commitment to certification, more companies certified. We also see more standards, more private standards. And in addition, we see the diffusion of public supply chain regulation in the timber sector, and now also to other sectors, so that we really have a deforestation-free regulation and not only timber companies ensuring that there was no deforestation in their supply chains. So I think the two can complement each other, but also not replace. And I think for companies, it's actually a race to the top, because now private certification initiatives need to show that that there's more commitment than just what is legally required.
And Pia, maybe you would like to add here, how do you think can a certification support companies with the due diligence obligations, the legal obligations?
Thank you. First of all, it provides a toolbox for risk assessment and also for reducing the risk in the supply chain. We, for example, also see as certification standards, as they have existed for a long time, now are aligning and continue to align with emerging regulations. And it also helps companies to, first of all, understand their obligations. We see that we offer, for example, tailored trainings to our system users that we can really help them to first understand their obligations and then basically take them by the hand. And certification helps to, or it gives a toolbox and instructions on how to get started. And apart from that, I mean, apart from aligning with current regulations, certification standards have and will continue to cover other aspects of sustainability that are not legally obligating yet. So it can also help not only for companies, but also for policymakers as an advisor in how to go about certain areas of sustainability that are not legally binding yet, but might become in the future or are specifically scrutinized by the public or by consumers. So that's also an area where we see that we can provide support and drive the common understanding and common good.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe just sort of in that context, and also sort of aligning with the race to the top. What we, especially at the end of last year, are now seeing that at least the German regulator, again, I'm always quoting the German regulator, but he's the one implementing the only really conclusive supply chain due diligence act at the moment. What we're seeing is that the quality of certification is also very, very important. And looking at the race to the top by certain certification bodies, it's always important to look, okay, what is being certified? Are the auditors properly instructed and trained? Are there people like Michael who are overseeing sort of auditing or operations, and really selecting certifications that match the needs of the company. And it seems, at least I take from your presentation from E&I, that E&I is very sort of looking at the certification, the content, not using 10 different certificates, but looking at what can match our needs, what works for our supply chain, looking at the governance criteria and all that. And with all these certificates that are out there, this will become more important now, I think, in the future under these new laws.
Yeah, Pia also mentioned in her presentation the importance of independent third-party auditing. And I think this is crucial. And now you also said that the auditors could consult the governments and so on. And I think that's all crucial, but we need to see that third-party auditing means that the auditors are paid by the companies, and they are private companies that actually depend on plantations and so on being certified, otherwise they don't have an income. Yeah, so it's not independent. And for instance, Fair Trade decided against the third-party auditor, but they have an in-house auditing. Yeah, because it allows them to better handle issues in cooperation with the farmers. So I think we need to pay attention. And I don't know. I think it's a problem if too much is public, because consumers are simple. So if they hear that Rewe doesn't comply with some legislation on a plantation, then Rewe immediately leaves the plantation, and of course then it's not good for the workers either. So in the EU CSDD, they actually have this saying that you should not immediately leave, but take appropriate steps and so on. And I think that's the idea of BAFA, to talk to the companies and not to make everything public. But at the same time, we also need the pressure. And I don't know what your thoughts are. I would be interested in how we can compromise between getting public attention to put pressure on companies. And I mean, it's nice to have a race to the top in terms of regulative uptake and more policy outlet, but we also need to see change on the ground. And what we see is that food insecurity is increasing. Yeah, we don't have less people, but we have more and more people suffering.
Please, Benedetta, yes.
Thank you. No, just to add something really briefly, the decertification really in what we have seen work in many challenging contexts for the agribusiness in Africa is that to help communities to reach certification standards, not only from our perspective, but from the producer perspective, really allows them to open new markets, to open 2 new markets. So we are working with communities that usually rely on traditional products with low value addition. Here we mentioned cocoa, we mentioned coffee, but this is a part of the agribusiness. It's not all the agribusiness sector. Most of the agribusiness sector rely on other type of crop, which for the most part of it are subsistence farming. And for those that are so lucky to work with this value chain and to have an external stakeholder to finance this kind of certification, they're already in the stream. But for others, well, then they're out of the market. So in our experience, really, in many countries, we see that actually operating a small-scale farming system out of this traditional added value chain, it really helps large part of the communities that are not included in international trading to be part of this. in other value chain. We talk about biofuel value chain, integrated them, but it's really a tool to raise the local standards of the local companies to the request of international market through existing value chain. This is from the producer perspective. And for us, especially FSS, was really an interesting exercise to evaluate to an external tool, actually the economic benefits of our initiative. So I think this is really useful example.
Yeah, just to add on that, and that's a very important point, and more specific to small-scale producer organizations, the one she's explaining that the subsistence farmers. In most of their times, they have no capacity to have their businesses sustainably produce. They depend on support, especially those that are working with supply chains that are sourcing in the global north, sourcing from the global south. For you to sustain your business, you need what we call support or pre-financing, for that matter, for you to be able to do your business, and then the company that is supporting you can now recoup back their support upon selling of that particular product. So that is a very important point to have in mind. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, we already came to the end of our panel discussion. I feel we could go on forever. It's such an interesting topic. Maybe after the panel, we can also just follow up a little bit here. We have some questions from the audience. I will now hand over.
Yeah, thanks a lot also from my side to all panelists. Great input and discussion so far. Thanks also, Lisa. We indeed received quite a number of questions from the audience on Slido. I will pick out two right away now. First of all, we have a question. The FSS seems to be a great initiative. What do you need to really roll this out and scale up? Who is supporting this? So maybe a question to ENI, maybe also something others can comment on. You know, what needs to be done to really reach some scale and go to additional countries, to additional crops? And the second question, right, in addition to that, it's actually for you, Max. Is it harder to work in human rights and sustainability law than other fields of law? But I would like to add to this question also something maybe to you, Michael, as an auditor, to you, Pia, as an owner of a certification system. So is it more difficult to really work on the human right to food and on the implementation of the food security standard? Is it more difficult to do these type of audits compared to other audits, maybe more focusing on environmental aspects?
Shall I start? So what do we need to scale up FSS? If this is the question, Jan, right? The first question.
What does it need from your perspective to scale up?
I'm really tempted to start this answer with money, but I'm not going to do that. No, but now, jokes aside, it's first the willingness of companies, of the private sector, and I really agree about this. Willingness of the private sector to scale up and really commitment on the territories, because a scheme like FSS really need to be entangled with local communities, and you have to have a footprint and a continuous effort on communities where actually we work. We are seeing that, just implementing and working hard. So it's really enlarging the collaboration with local stakeholders in order to make the concept of FSS mainstream in the job that local governments are actually already doing, and internalize the main principle of FSS, which is actually should be there. It is our effort and should be the effort of many companies in the practices that we're implementing, especially in production. This is, in my opinion, the only way to scale up the efforts.
Maybe I can add to this. I think what's also important to understand in terms of food security is that it is the backbone, or it's such a fundamental right, the right to food, that it forms the foundation of so many, and I would say even almost all social criteria. So it is really something to focus on if you're trying to fulfill social criteria, but also legal obligations, because at the end of the day, at least this is what my experience and exchange with local farmers shows, maybe Michael, you also have a take on this, is that it comes down what people have on their dinner table at the end of the day, and if this right is not fulfilled, it will be difficult to impossible to implement other sustainability criteria, may it be environmental, or any other criteria, because this is such a fundamental thought and need of farmers, workers, but also farm owners. So it is really a change of perspective that this is where you need to start, and I think this also then helps to scale up FSS in the perception of businesses and what it provides and what it actually means.
Yeah, from my perspective, I would say yes. I answer the question as yes. But let it be understood that the right to food is a human right. It is provided for, I think, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And therefore, if that has to be actualized, then there's need for all stakeholder participation into that process. And how I look at it is that food security standard is one of the measures through which this right to food can be achieved. And with proper commitments, sharing of responsibilities, that it's possible. We've seen cases where, like programs where we have combined audits, it is easy to scale up, or rather to carry out the food security standard implementation on the ground, which then now the producers have an opportunity to put in measures to work towards improving their food security standard. So by and large, I would say yes. Thanks.
Great, okay. Then maybe to Max.
Yeah, so the question was, is it more difficult to work in sort of human rights due diligence law than other fields of law? And the answer is definitely yes. Because, and I can give some concrete examples, there is neither in CSDDD nor in the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, and even for most parts of the EUDR, very little clarity on exactly what are the obligations that you have and what is the goal of these. I can provide one specific example. In the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, it is an administrative offense, meaning you could get a fine if you don't do your risk analysis correctly. Nowhere in the law does it say what is a correct risk analysis. I can't say exactly what it is. There's no jurisprudence. There's no case law, no current cases that really say, okay, you know, this IT solution does the risk analysis correctly. It's really difficult. And I think the best example, and Lena mentioned this in her presentation, the best example of how open these laws are sort of formulated in a way of you know, legal terminology where we don't really know what it means is the reporting requirements. We see some reports have been publicized, and the differences in quality are amazing. I mean, there's large companies with billions of turnover who say, we have no risks in our supply chain, none at all. We haven't discovered any risks in our supply chain. There's others who say, you know, we have cases, you know, every day. And that doesn't match up. For large companies, there's obviously some sort of risks always of human rights violations, even in Germany with looking at labor standards, et cetera. And so it's very difficult in advising concretely. We are happy that we have a lot of cases with BAFA where we at least get the regulator's view on some of these issues. Different question if these views are correct or not, but that's how I think in 10 years we'll be ready to really say this is how it goes.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we need to come to an end before I hand over to you, Svante Nilsson. Let me make a final comment from FSS perspective. I think what we have really seen is we need commitment from all sides. We need the commitment from the companies over here, but throughout the entire value chain. We need the commitment from the certification systems, from the certification bodies, from the auditors, to really increase knowledge, to work on this, to better implement this. We need support from the legal side. We need support from the science, from research perspective to better implement this. And we heard some very interesting topics around that as well. And I would say for sure we also need support from the regulators and from the policy environment. And having said that, I think I hand over to you for a final statement. Thanks a lot.
All right. Yes, thank you so much, Jan Henke. And I'm, first of all, apologies for coming in so late, but it's always been that difficult for us because there's some strategic meeting that we also, of course, need to take advantage of to bring in everything that is happening also here in the framework of the Global Forum for Food and Agriculture. I thank you very much. I was briefed a little bit. I could also listen a little bit to what you said, and I'm very, very impressed. So first of all, welcome to the GFFA also from our side of the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. Thank you very much, Jan Henke, and also Raphael Schneider, but also, of course, Theresa Hering and Marie Brika for really moderating this in a way. I think that's become a very constructive discussion here this time. Thank you very much, of course, to the panelists and dear participants. I think you're all true champions of something which is extremely challenging. I remember being here last year, and I feel that it was most important to tell everybody to please stay in the room with us, because this is the deep valley where we have to really work ourselves through the complexity of making sustainability work, of really incorporating human rights into how we work with each other, how trade can function, how we can come up with business models that really work for everybody. And I think that one of the crowns, as we would say in Germany, you know, the really nice things on top of everything else is this food security standard. So I'm very proud also to see how it has developed. Thank you so much also, Jan Henke and Raphael Schneider, for 1 decade of really working yourselves through this. And you really can be sure that you have our full commitment, and I really would like to support this. I learned a lot from you already in those few minutes, and I think it's very interesting to see that you say the right to life, for example, of course always includes also food security and the right to food. I think that is something very important to build on. I understand the CSDDD also has incorporated it, so bit by bit it's really working to incorporate things. I think it's also very important what you said about the consultations with the farmers. We cannot lose that, right? When you come up with regulations and try to do that very quickly, the impression can be there that this is something abstract. It has nothing really to do with the work on the ground of the farmers themselves. And that was also a debate last year. And I think that you now take it up and say that everybody is really aware of it and sometimes decides on in-house work in that regard. Even auditing is maybe also part of that, to try to bring things together. And that is exactly, of course, also what we are trying to do, who we as a government really need to bridge, to build bridges, to facilitate processes, to bring everybody together into one room. And I think that is what is really happening also this week. I understand that the Green Week very much profits from the GFFA because it brings in the world all the foreign delegations in a different way. It's become a matchmaking tool for everybody, for business, for civil society, for governments, and it's really enhancing everything. I think in the world that is so virtual these days, it's so important we meet even physically. We allow everybody also to participate virtually, maybe in a hybrid manner. But it's so important to meet because there things can happen, and here they are happening. we hopefully have really come up even with a communiqué on bioeconomy, because we do believe in bioeconomy becoming, one of, maybe really the big bridges to bring things together, and that it's been so difficult, although we've had a bioeconomy strategy on many levels for so long already, is maybe also because there were also, can we really trust that process? Is it really something that takes into account human rights? And that is why it's so important to have an add-on at least, and maybe mainstream one day, of a food security standard. I think it's happening here right now, and if it really is there tomorrow afternoon, I think we will see that in the multilateral world, FAO will hopefully take it on board and come up with this bioeconomy partnership to really make sure that we have all the sustainability dimensions and, of course, the right to food. The CFS is also hosted by FAO, so all the voluntary guidelines come in together to really build and become another stepping stone, but also, again, this big bridge for everybody, including, of course, also the governments to come in and define what bioeconomy really means for them together. Because sometimes it's also easier to have it, a little bit vague as a definition, because then it can be this or also that. And I think your work really also leads to simply the door now to maybe find ourselves in a room where we can be courageous enough to really talk about it also together, to see what does it mean for us and what can we really build on together, including maybe one day stronger legal frameworks also globally. I think it's extremely important to say we do not want to leave anybody behind, including our planet, by the way, right? So the natural resources are key. To really have food security for everybody and ensure the right to food for everybody, and this add-on to make sure that human rights, really these standards can help to enable trade and really business models, I think is key to leave the world a better place, also for the generations to come. So please include also the young generation. I think it's become very clear this week. We've done a lot in the past years to include them. We have a huge generational change happening right now around the world. The African continent, for example, has sometimes a very young population. It's unclear, what are their perspectives in the rural areas. They are the ones that are the cradle of food production, but at the same time, this is also where the hunger still is the most. So how to really tackle that? The rest of the world really faces more very, very old farmers on average, and I think we need to see how the generational change can also be a proper perspective for them. So the world really needs to talk together, and I think to really have a framework, a rules-based framework, and if it's voluntary with the standards, that is a stepping stone that is really pivotal to also come up then for the governments with maybe more. I wanted, of course, to say a little bit more, but I'm getting too long, I think, because this is really coming to an end. But I think what is important, what you said, and that I really want to maybe just say one more time, is that it's an opportunity with the FSS for the companies to really do it the right way. But I think what you also have confirmed, that it's not always clear to everybody what the risks really are in their way of doing business. And that addressing those risks from your side makes clear to them that the violations of the right to food represent a considerable economic risk for the companies in the long run. So I think, this is a little bit the balance, to really give it to them as an opportunity, but also make them aware if they do not really try to go for that one day, it can be really difficult for them. So we can win them over, to become part, right, of this movement to really go to the future. So I will end, to make it not too long, with a big wish of mine. Please use this week here, including, of course, this very interesting panel, to make it mainstream, to really make it work for business models. It's an add-on, but it has to become mainstream for everybody, and I think it's mature. Make this week a starting point for harvesting time in the real sense. In that regard, we have been working for more than a decade now. For 2 decades, we've had the voluntary guidelines on the right to food. For 10 years, we're working on this food security standard. You're working on it. Thank you very much for that again. So it needs us all to communicate better, to all be the ones to really bring the message, to convey the message to everybody and make it work also economically so the trade can really have a good footing, a stable footing. Thank you so much, and I hope to meet again next year and that you will stay with us. Everybody stayed in the room. I'm very well aware of that, and I think that's a brilliant sign. It seems that you're really on the right track. Thank you so much again for coming here. Yeah, even more people came in, so that's really fantastic. This is a success story and it should grow. Thank you.